Good evening, everyone. My name is Liz Joyner. I'm founder and president of the Village Square, and on behalf of the Village Square and Florida Humanities, we're delighted you've joined us tonight for Outraged, Why We Fight About Morality and Politics and How to Find Common Ground with our very special guest, Kurt Gray. This program is made possible by funding from Florida Humanities through the National Endowment for the Humanities. It's part of a multi-year series of digital programs, Unum, Democracy Reignited, presented in partnership with Florida Humanities, exploring the past, present, and future of the American idea as it exists on paper, in the hearts of our people, and as it manifests in our lives. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Florida Humanities or National Endowment for the Humanities. If you are not familiar with the work of NEH and Florida Humanities, we're putting their web addresses in chat. Be sure to check them out. The chat window will be closed tonight, but if you ask questions at any time during the program by clicking on the Q&A link at the bottom of your screen, if you haven't taken our pre-event survey yet, if you'll just take a moment to do so now, we're dropping the link in the chat as well. Your honest and anonymous answers will help the Village Square with a major nationally scoped research effort to better understand divisions in the United States. Even if you've done the survey for another program, we ask if you can complete it again. We are delighted to welcome streaming partners, Bridge USA, USC Center for the Political Future, Living Room Conversations, National Institute for Civil Discourse, Listen First Project, Common Ground Committee, Braver Angels, Civic Health Project, McCourtney Institute for Democracy at Unify, Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other podcast, Citizen Connect, Center for the Humanities at University of Miami, Network for Responsible Public Policy, and our wonderful long-term local partners, Tallahassee Democrat and WFSU Public Media. Joining us tonight to facilitate the program is Dr. Molly Worthen. Molly is an associate professor of history at UNC Chapel Hill. Go Heels. Her research focuses on North American religious and intellectual history. Her books include Apostles of Reason, The Crisis of Authority in American Evangelicalism, and the upcoming Spellbound, How Charisma Shaped American History from the Puritans to Donald Trump. It will be out on May 27th, and we'll pop the link for that book in the chat as well. She has also created courses for Audible on the history of charismatic leadership, as well as the history of global Christianity since the Reformation. She writes regularly about religion, politics, and higher education for the New York Times and has also contributed to Politico, The New Yorker, Slate, American Prospect, Foreign Policy, and other publications. Molly, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
And it is also now my pleasure to introduce our special guest, Dr. Kurt Gray. Kurt is a professor in psychology and neuroscience at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Did I say Go Heels before? Where he directs the Deepest Beliefs Lab and the Center for Science of Moral Understanding. He is also an adjunct professor in organizational behavior at the Keenan Flagler Business School at UNC, where he teaches about organizational ethics and team processes. The author of two books, The Mind Club, Who Thinks, What Feels, and Why It Matters, and his recent book, which we're here to talk about tonight, Outraged, Why We Fight About Morality and Politics and How to Find Common Ground. Dr. Gray received his PhD from Harvard University. Kurt, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
So we're putting a bunch of links in the chat, both for Molly's work and for Kurt's. And I wanted to just put a plug in for his Substack, A Moral Understanding. I get the best, most wonderful, entertaining, and informative posts from that. So I highly recommend that you check it out. And I am going to go ahead and leave it to Molly and Kurt. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Liz. Kurt, this book is so timely and it is so fun to get to ask you questions about it. And I've got my copy here and I'm just looking at the cover and the title in particular. And I'm just wondering if there are a lot of people who look at this title and think, yes, I'm outraged and I have every right to be. And why should I read a book by some guy who thinks apparently I should try to understand people on the other side who are totally destroying the country? So my first question is, what do you say to those people?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, I think I was, excited that people are angry maybe for the book, but not excited that people are this angry. I don't think any American is excited for this level of anger. But what I usually say to folks about why we should try to understand the other side is maybe two things. So one, what I wrote the book for was so people could better connect with those on the other side in their families, in their friend groups, in their workplaces, and in their communities, right? These are connections with everyday people who you want to connect more with and kind of make sense of their behavior and their thoughts. This is not about finding common ground with someone like Elon Musk, for instance, right? A political elite or maybe a host on cable news. It's not about seeing eye to eye with those people, but instead reconnecting with the people you've lost contact with in your life. And I guess the second thing I'll say is that, I think that there's value in reconnecting just as building community spirit and just as like a human being connecting with others. But even if you're more cynical about it and you're thinking, well, look, how do we just kind of, win when it comes to politics? I think even there, you have to understand the other side, right? If you're trying to figure out what someone else is thinking and feeling to make coalitions with them, to find allies, it's important to think about how exactly someone thinks. And I think there's a lot of misinformation about there and myths about how we think and how we act in the world. And this book's about rectifying that situation, about painting a correct picture, and then that will help us kind of move forward politically, I think, too.
I appreciate how you have kind of two pragmatic cases for why this book, is worth engaging with, even if you're so frustrated, because there's a sort of lane of your everyday life, but also this question of kind of political strategy, and that makes a lot of sense to me. One thing that is so effective about this book is that you do a lot of storytelling. And so before we get into some of the meatier issues, I would just love if you could tell one of my favorite stories in this book, which is from somewhat deep in your past when you were working for that oil and natural gas exploration company in the northern Canadian wilderness, and this particular very cold night that you had up there. And in a weird way, it seems like that night kind of gave you a taste of one of the key insights of your research. So can you tell that story?
You bet. And I know we've both been in northern Alberta, and there's not many folks out there, so very happy to recount that night. I grew up in Canada, and I started out my college in geophysics. So that's like looking for things in the ground, like oil, like gas. Alberta is all about that. And one semester, I worked for a company that was looking for things in the really far north of Alberta. And so to kind of figure out how to get there, you basically go to the border of Montana and Alberta, and then you drive 18 hours straight north, and then you turn left. There's not many roads out there. You turn left and you drive another hour, and you're in a place called Rainbow Lake, if you want to look it up. There's not many people there. And then every morning we got on a helicopter and then flew, I don't know, 30, 50 miles, something like that, to a site where we were looking for natural gas. And that meant pounding stakes in the ground in the permafrost kind of thing. And then just doing some things like running some tests and then waiting to get picked up in the afternoon. Well, one evening, a storm rolled into Rainbow Lake and visibility dropped. And we got a radio from the helicopter pilot, who's normally not a risk-averse man. He chose like helicoptering in the north, and his favorite phrase was something like, 8 hours bottle to throttle. So he was down to take risks, but he said, "Look, visibility's too low, and I can't come and get you. I'll see you tomorrow. Sorry." And so we're trapped, in the Canadian wilderness that night. It got down to about minus 10 degrees Celsius. So I'm like spooning with these other guys. Too cold. We light a fire. We're curling up around the fire. And then partway through the night, it's very dark and no one's around for 50 miles. I kind of get this like unnerving sense that I'm being watched, but it's not like a horror movie. There's not like some prison escapee in there, but I couldn't shake this feeling of like, getting watched, being watched. And sure enough, when dawn comes, we look around the campsite and there are paw prints surrounding us. It was a lynx. And now a lynx is not big enough to kill an adult man, typically, but it feels like something you wouldn't want to gamble with, right? And so all of us were just a little unnerved knowing that we had been investigated and potentially kind of stalked in the night. And so we got picked up, went back to the hotel, ate a big meal of meat, and eggs. But still, it felt like in that instance, we were the prey, right? We think that humans are apex predators, but that made me really realize that, like, we're not as strong as we think. We're not as powerful as we think. When we're trapped in the wilderness, the primary emotion that you feel is unease and fear, and not this sense of like bloodlust and predatory nature.
So that night triggered some primordial instinct, right? It sounds like it just kind of came and overtook you. It wasn't something that you got to rationally. And that seems so important for what you're trying to communicate in this book. And it's counterintuitive, though, because often I think we tend to try to explain today's culture wars by emphasizing recent developments. We talk a lot about the internet and social media. People do analyses of economic shifts of the past 5 years, or maybe at most the past generation. But you're telling us that actually we need to go back millions of years to understand the polarization of 2025.
That's right. And
how do you make that argument?
yeah. And so I don't argue against recent trends. Those are incredibly important. But I think if we want to understand political polarization today, we need to understand the human mind. And to do that, we need to think about how the human mind evolved over millions of years. So much further back than even the kind of dawn of kind of modern civilization. And so 4 million years ago, when we were transitioning from species to species, eventually into Homo sapien, right? That the picture of life in that time is very different than people thought. So there's an anthropologist who thought that Australopithecus represented the kind of transition from like we're fruit eaters to now we're like predators. And from 4 million years on, we're like ruthless predators, like hunting, stalking, right? Always on the lookout for things to kill. And it turns out he was entirely wrong, right? So what he thought was evidence of like butchery and like cannibalism and ruthless violence was actually evidence that our kids were eaten by eagles. I kind of dig into the book, right? But like you could be out in the plains, whatever, like picking fruit, and then a big eagle comes and like picks off your kid. And I mean, that's a bad day for everybody. And so it turns out that the anthropological evidence really suggests that we were more hunted than hunter, which means that we're constantly on guard for threats, right? We're constantly afraid. It's why our kids are afraid of the dark today, right? It's why we huddle together for safety. And it's why if you're out in the wilderness, you can do this right now if you live near a forest, just like strip down to your underwear and go into the woods at night and see how you feel. It's probably not like, oh my goodness, I can't wait to eat something, right? You're like, oh my, that twig snapped and I'm terrified. And so we don't fear predators in the same way today, not wild animals, but we still fear moral predators. We're still on the lookout. So if your kids are playing outside and there's like a white panel van that drives by slowly back the other way, right? You don't think, I wonder if that's a lost locksmith. You think, right, I bet that's a kidnapper and they're going to steal my kids. And it's so rare that that happens, but that's where your mind goes. And so we're always on the lookout for threats. And that happens in the political moment too, right? On our side, on their side, whatever side you're on, you're always concerned about threats. And that's the kind of mind we bring to political and moral conflicts.
I know that as a professional social psychologist, when you are in conversation and debates often with colleagues who have a range of approaches to understanding these dynamics, understanding the human mind, and you've landed on this emphasis on our prey mindset and our sensitivity to harm. But there are, of course, other ways of thinking about these questions. So can you walk us through, maybe talking a little bit about your own biography, how you got there as a student of the human mind? Like what was your process of working through various approaches to these questions, and why ultimately did you find this approach to be the most persuasive?
Yeah, great question. So, like many moral psychologists, right? I mean, I think many of us have an experience kind of like with almost an uncertainty of our moral convictions, maybe is one way to say it. So, when I was a kid, my stepmom came into my life. My dad married my stepmom, and she's from a very large, very evangelical family in Nebraska. And when I went there as a kid, this huge family opened their arms to me. They were so loving, so kind, despite the fact that I was a foreigner as a Canadian and a stepkid. And I thought we had everything in common because we liked swimming in the pond and playing in the hayloft, right? But then as we got older, it became clear that we disagreed about a lot of things, like let's say gay marriage, right? When that passed, the Oberfeld case, right? They were very upset and thought that it kind of like denied God's will, and certainly most of the people that I knew were celebrating. But I couldn't just write off half the country as they were represented and just say, well, like those people are evil or those people are stupid, because I know they weren't. And so I started doing studies, to try to figure out, well, how do our minds work, and like what really underlies our moral disagreement. And there was another theory, and that's still out there, called moral foundations theory. We don't need to go into it. Its champion is Jonathan Haidt, and he kind of argues that liberals and conservatives, care about fundamentally different values, right? Like conservatives are maybe more religious than liberals, and I think in some ways that's true. But when I ran the studies and I really kind of like delved into kind of how people thought about things, so you can do things like put people under time pressure and see how they react kind of like intuitively. So what are people's like visceral, you mentioned the word visceral, right? These like visceral intuitions about morality. And every time I ran a study, what was clear was that the reason people made their moral judgments is because they saw specific acts or people as harmful, right? So the reason that we condemn something is because we see it as harmful. But I want to emphasize the word see or feel even, right? That if we feel like something's harmful, even if it seems objectively okay, we still think it's immoral, right? So there's lots of arguments that moral psychologist comes up with, lots of scenarios that are really weird and bizarre, like eating your dead dog, right, that died of natural causes, or doing salacious things with frozen chickens that we don't need to go into it if people are eating, right? So there's like, and these things, some moral psychologists say, well, those are harmless things. But when you think about those things, right, you get this gut feeling of harm. And this is what really drives our moral intuitions, gut feelings that something is harmful, and then we want to condemn that. So that's what our moral intuitions are all about.
I'm glad you mentioned the example of your Nebraska extended family, because that's one interesting vignette in the book where you go into a kind of a case study of modeling how to think about people with whom you disagree about pretty profound things. And you talk about the different narratives through which we might understand someone on the other side of an important issue. So can you say a little bit about these concepts you have in the book, the protection narrative and the destruction narrative, and how navigating those has helped you relate to extended family?
Sure. So when we think about people on the other side, our kind of like gut reaction is that they are bent on destruction. We think of them almost like a Marvel supervillain, right? They just want to watch the world burn. And that is entirely wrong. So one reason we think that way, right, is because going back to this idea that we're like predators, right? When we think of the actions of the other side, we think of them as predators, right? Like they're cold and confident and just doing things to destroy the country. But the behavior of people, everyday people on the other side, is not motivated by destruction, right? The destruction narrative does not characterize their behavior. Instead, it's more accurate to explain their behavior with this idea of protection. It's the protection narrative, right? When people vote a certain way or donate to political causes, it's because they're trying to protect themselves and their families and society, or even those who they see as vulnerable. So everyone who's listening today, right? Like if you think about why you vote the way you do, it's because you're concerned about threats, right? Because you're trying to protect the country and those you hold dear. And that's true on the other side too. We just often fail to appreciate it because we're locked in this us versus them struggle. But I think the protection narrative is much more accurate when thinking about conflict.
That makes a lot of sense. I have it's sort of intuitive, but at the same time, and you and I, we're colleagues, and we argue about this stuff all the time. And I come at these questions a little differently, just because I'm a historian, and I guess I'm primed to maybe make a lot of the differences between different cultures and different historical eras. So I'm wondering whether there is ever a danger in framing every anxiety and priority in human social life as a fear of some kind of harm, and whether that tendency that could be a very kind of Western centric impulse, because the idea of the harm principle has had kind of outsized influence in Western culture, since, I mean, at least the late 18th century. I'm thinking of like the famous line in the French Revolution's Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Liberty consists in the freedom to do everything which injures no one else, right? Like we're sort of focused on that and how we think about liberty, but maybe in other cultures, ancient China, Soviet Russia, like what have you, it might be, I don't know, inappropriate to apply that frame. So how do you think about this question of cross-cultural difference and your emphasis on harm?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, I'm not an anthropologist, but when I look at anthropology, especially the social anthropology of morality, that's one of the things that really inspired this idea that our minds are motivated by harm, right? And so the famous example in our field is a social anthropologist, cultural anthropologist named Richard Schwader. He's at the University of Chicago. And at a time in psychology when everyone was talking about rights and responsibilities, right, very Western sense, as you say, he went to India, it's in the 80s and late 70s, and worked with a group of Brahmin Indians and examined how they talked about morality. And so what he found was that, as you argue, not only do these folks talk about rights and responsibility, autonomy that he emphasized, but they also talk about things like community, cohesion, and solidarity, and purity or divinity, right? Kind of respecting God and respecting kind of the spiritual forces that surrounded them. And so this made it seem like folks in India had a very different kind of like moral experience than maybe Westerners. But then again, right, if you think of like more conservative folks in the West, like certainly there's talk about community and certainly there's talk about divinity and purity. And even if you talk to progressives, right, community, like unions are about community solidarity, right? HOAs maybe about community. And you could have all sorts of purity among liberals too, right? If I tell you about someone who had a juice cleanse and then did hot yoga to purify their like body, right? You're like, that's a progressive, right? So I think there's diversity, not just across cultures, but also within our culture. But going back to this idea of harm, right? He emphasized like these are the conversational themes that people are talking about. Talk about purity and taking your shoes off before you enter the home or the temple. It seemed not really about harm. The one example I really like is that he found that some folks in Brahmin India think that it is immoral for an eldest son to eat chicken after his father's funeral. Seems like a little convoluted, right? And seems obviously to us Westerners as being harmless. And so this example was kind of brought back to the West as like a shining example of like, look, folks over there don't care about harm in the same way we do because this is clearly harmless. But I think if you want to be a good anthropologist, and I think Rick did some of this work, you really have to figure out the assumptions of a culture, right? You have to live it and think about the causal structures. He calls it the kind of causal ontologies that underlie it. And it turns out that for these Brahmin Indians, the reason they think that it is immoral for the eldest son to eat chicken is because doing so stops that son from processing his father's death pollution. And in doing so, condemns his father to basically eternal suffering, right? In like a purgatory. And so what seems to be harmless to Westerners, actually, if you take the assumptions of the culture, is actually full of harm, right? So when I think about questions of harm, it's not that I am saying that these things are harmful. It's that the cultures themselves tie these perceptions of harm to immorality. And so I think that provides a nice, powerful kind of common currency or framework for making sense of different cultural differences when it comes to morality through different understandings of harm, right? So I'm not saying that you can't differ across cultures, but what I am saying is that it's both understandings of harm and morality that differ across cultures.
I really appreciate the way you lay that out. I study religion a lot of the time, and you're speaking to something that I find kind of frustrating because I often find that people who come from a totally secular framework, they have a really hard time entertaining the possibility that people in devout religious communities actually believe this stuff. They actually take seriously a set of supernatural claims about the world that have very real implications for their daily life, the universe, everything. And it sounds like you're suggesting that this relatively simple framework of harm can give people kind of a like a almost a highway from one worldview to at least starting to approach another and begin to kind of look at the world from that other perspective and take it seriously in a way that I think otherwise our culture really doesn't prime us to. I mean, we're so quick to write off the presuppositions of other people as absurd for one reason or another. But as you say, it's this idea of common currency, which is so lacking right now.
That's right. That's right. And so I write in the book that if you want to understand the minds or morals of someone you disagree with, ask yourself, what harms do they see? Right. And I think this is especially hard as you highlight when you're crossing kind of the boundary between the secular and the more religious, because there's all sorts of assumptions that people make that are different, right? If you believe in an immortal soul, that comes with it a lot of different assumptions than if you don't. But even, more prosaic arguments, right? Perhaps with, liberals versus conservatives in your hometown, or even an argument with your spouse. I mean, a lot of the ideas in the book are not just about kind of politics, right? But anyone you disagree with, anyone like at work or in your neighborhood, right? So maybe you're disagreeing. Well, here's an example that I haven't brought up before, right? So we have a neighbor, and he's really against clover in our HOA. We share, the our land in our HOA, and he's just really against clover. And other folks are like, look, but if you put down pesticide, right, it's going to hurt the kids who run over the grass. And like that's clearly a harm-based argument, right? And so if you're on the pro clover side and anti pesticide, you're like, that's just crazy, right? He just like some just like aesthetic zealot for no clover, right? But if you talk to him, he thinks, well, clover is going to just ruin all of our property values, right? You like look out and no one will want to buy this house ever again because it's just so ugly, right? And then you'll lose that kind of like equity in your house, and then there'll be this kind of destruction down the road for your family. And I think it's kind of a funny example, but there's a woman named Anita Bryant, who's a kind of anti-gay rights activist. And her argument for the kind of spread of gay rights was that children would see gay folks together, be kind of inspired to be gay, and then not have kids because obviously, it's fabulous to be gay if you don't have to spend money on children. You can go on vacation in Mallorca or wherever all the time. And then without kids, society gets like destroyed and then nuclear holocaust. I mean, I know there's like some ellipses there and you're like, how do we get there? But the point is that, right, I think Anita Bryant genuinely thought that, this spread of gay rights would cause harm to society for many reasons. And people dismissing that, I think, dismiss her logic and the logic of many people who think like her. And so to bring it back to the political moment, if you're thinking about things like, I don't know, tariffs or budget cuts, right? All these things are tied in some ways, at least to the folks who kind of advocate for them, to perceptions of harm. And that's how you should make sense of them. Think about like, what harms do they see?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think even when I think about the research I do among conservative Christian communities today, and when I get into these conversations about gay marriage, I think your dichotomy of the protection and destruction narratives are really helpful. I mean, I would say, Anita Bryant's logic. I mean, there may be some conservative evangelicals who would still gravitate towards that narrative, but I think it looks quite different now. And I talk to conservative evangelicals who would make kind of a different sort of argument about harm. They would say that, God has a certain picture of human sexuality and marriage, and marriage is meant as a picture of our relationship to God. And there's a way in which our modern culture has taught us to just totally define our identity in terms of sexuality, and that has this dehumanizing effect. Like we end up, they would say, worshiping an idol, and it makes our experience of human life much less than it could be. But I think your point still holds, that actually the way to understand that perspective is to ask, what is the damage that they see happening to gay people, to the community? Not, oh my gosh, conservative Christians hate gay people, and they,
Right.
they don't have respect for them as individuals. That's, I think, really not an accurate picture.
Hmm.
So I appreciate how your framework kind of gives secular liberals a tool for, I guess, listening a little bit, and at least hearing that, even if they don't agree with it.
Right. Yeah. Right. And I think yeah, that's knowledge to me. So I didn't realize like that's the framework that I think they see gay rights through now. But it is kind of reassuring that no matter where we are, right, it's kind of perceptions of harm. And I guess, right, the hard thing is because these understandings of harm are visceral and they're intuitive, it can be difficult to really appreciate that the other side is genuine. But the analogy I usually like to make is someone who's like afraid of flying, right? And so if someone's up in the air and they're sweating and they're twitching and they're looking out their window, and you sitting next to them and you say, "Look, why are you so afraid? Why are you?" And they're like, "Oh, I'm afraid I'm going to die," right? I feel like I'm going to die. We're in a little metal tube, 30,000 feet in the air. It's like lethal. And they say, "Well, here's some statistics about the safety of flying relative to driving." And they're like, "I get those statistics." And they're like, "Okay, well, so you should not be shaking and sweating anymore." But of course they are, right? Because that's about kind of visceral perceptions of harm. And I think with flying, it's not about morality. But if you think about these things as something that's like really ingrained in our psychology and even in our bodies, right? These kind of reactions that something's harmful, then I think it's a really powerful way to understand the kind of genuineness of where people are coming from. Even if you disagree with them, right? You don't have to disagree, you don't have to agree with folks, but just to kind of understand where they're at.
That airplane analogy, it underlies or it underscores something that I was thinking about reading your book, which is the fact that modern society, I mean, we've never, in, America in the 21st century, we've never been safer, like physically, in most of our communities. We have unprecedented safety from physical threats. I mean, you mentioned the parental fear of your kid being abducted. And, that maybe is something that happened in a, still, statistically unlikely, but occasional way a generation ago. But now it is even rarer, right? And yet parents are more, prone to hovering over their kids than ever before. I guess my question is, why, if society is safer by all the statistics we have, why hasn't the harm detector part of our brain gotten less active? Like, why are we so disconnected from the reality of our physical safety?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the short answer is that it's programmed so deep within us that we can't just give it up, right? So for millions of years, the people, the Homo sapiens, even before that, who survived to have kids, those were the folks that were always worried about harm, right? What's that in the darkness? What are my kids doing? Are they safe? And so it was always better for evolution, basically, to make us worry about threats. And so we have this like deep need to just identify threats and what are they in our society and in our house, or you hear like a creak downstairs when you're sleeping and you're like, oh wow, it's probably a burglar, should I go check it out? And so this is so hardwired within us. But then when society gets safer, as you say, we still feel this uneasy detection that we seek out these threats. And because we're trying so hard, what we do is we pull threats that didn't used to be threatening into things that actually now are threatening. And so an example, right, is social media, right? If you went back I don't know, 3 generations, even 1 generation, but 3 generations, and you were like, look, one of the biggest problems in society today is people saying mean things to each other in 160 words, you know, and then like clicking a little button about it. People would be like, what? Like, I'm worried that my kids aren't going to come home because they're working in the factory or whatever. You know, my 10-year-old's in the factory. Um, and so I don't really understand where you're coming from, right? But because we're not worried about our kids' safety as much anymore from things like that, we worry about our kids' safety of walking home, right? Or social media. And so I think another example is like, think about something like food, right? So we are really wired to detect food because we need it every day. And in today's society, we have so much food. You go to the grocery store, everything's food. And so if I ask you, is a tin of cat food human food? You would say, that's gross. I'm not eating a tin of cat food. But now let's imagine, right, that food is much rarer, like threats are today. There's no more food just kind of like around in grocery stores. We're like scavenging. It's post-apocalyptic. And then you come around a tin of cat food, right? You'd be like, oh my goodness, delicious cat food. And you rip it open and start eating it, right, with gusto, because we're hardwired to detect it. And that thing is getting more rare. And so the idea of what counts as food creeps, right? It goes to new things. And with harm's the same way, right? It seemed back in the day, we were worried about all these very clear harms, like kids falling out of cars. We didn't have seatbelts, but now that we're safe, now we think about like kids using social media or walking home alone, whatever, right? Harm has crept.
This concept, well, concept creep is the phrase you use in the book. It's so helpful. I mean, I think a lot of what you're doing in this book is giving us language to become a little more aware of very common mental habits so that we can see ourselves doing it and kind of catch it and reorient. Another concept in this book that I think is something that identifies a, I don't know, a hurdle to the kind of more productive interaction that you're aiming for is moral typecasting. Can you talk a little bit about that? What is it? Why do we do it so much?
Right. So the idea of moral typecasting is kind of inspired by Hollywood typecasting. So if you walk down the street and you see Daniel Radcliffe, you don't think, oh, Daniel Radcliffe, like one of the stars of Swiss Army Man, right? Obviously not. You think like that's Harry Potter, amazing. Like, what's Gryffindor like? You know? And so we typecast actors into enduring moral role or enduring roles. And just as we do that, we typecast others into enduring moral roles. And those two roles are either villains or victims. And so when in reality, right, we might be morally complicated, right? Some people might do the right thing for the wrong reasons or the wrong thing for the right reasons. And, you know, it's all kind of shades of gray. But when we kind of think about the moral world, we do so with a mind that likes to simplify things into black and white. And so maybe someone's a little bit of a victim, but we see them as entirely a villain. Or someone's a little bit of a villain, but we see them entirely as a victim. And so what that means is that we don't appreciate the kind of like nuance in people. And so these are extreme examples, and this is, so take it for what it is, right? But the opening line of the chapter on moral typecasting is, no one ever thinks of Hitler's inner pain. And fair enough, he's a total monster, right? But the idea is like, look, he was abused as a kid, but the fact that he did all these terrible things, most terrible things you can think of, right, means that we don't ever think of him as suffering, right? We just don't like the idea of even like pondering this kind of complexity. The other example I cover in the book is this poor kid who was abused by his stepfather or by his stepmother and his dad. I mean, just years of abuse. It was so terrible. And then eventually he murders his dad and his stepmom and his stepsister. It seems like a terrible act, but the jury, upon learning how much he was abused, say, well, he's not a villain, he's a victim, right? So we really simplify the world. And these are extreme examples, right? So it makes sense. Maybe you're not thinking about Hitler's inner pain, but in everyday life, we do that too, right? Maybe your mother-in-law, right? She always is giving you that dirty look. And so you just think of her totally as a villain, or maybe your wife, because you were mean to her one time, right? Think of her as entirely as a victim. And these competing perceptions of villains and victim in the world drive a ton ton of moral conflict, right? Because you look at someone and you say they're a victim, and other people say they're a villain, and it's hard to come to agreement.
If we've been operating, for millions and millions of years on this assumption that we have to be constantly on the lookout for harm, I guess I would think that that tendency to think of ourselves as victims, that would be this primordial thing. But I can't resist the sense that there is a vogue for competitive victimhood now, like the victim Olympics seems to be one of the major modes of social media, especially. I mean, is this just by imagination? I mean, or is there something about our culture now, whether it's media driven or otherwise, that has really sharpened this part of our instinctual programming?
Yeah, great question. So the allure of victimhood, I think, has always been there because, I mean, the thing about moral typecasting is that if you're a victim in the eyes of others, you're not a villain. And that means you escape all blame, right? And so this is why my kids, when they're fighting and like someone's going to get in trouble, something breaks, right? And I've got two kids, then each of them is like crying, be like, well, they started it, I'm the victim here. Because whoever gets to be the victim is like, oh, you poor thing. And then the villain is like, go get a timeout, right? And so we do this all the time. Conflict in the real world, even nations compete for victimhood. And I think it's been something that we've done for a long time. But I think today's culture, because we're interacting with so many people that we don't have a lot in common with, for instance, on social media, and because kind of questions of harm are a common currency, then we're all competing for victimhood because it's all something we understand and it powerfully escapes blame, right? And so there's all sorts of messy moral issues. And whoever gets to be the victim, right, gets to enjoy sympathy on social media. And whoever gets called the villain, right, gets canceled, gets yelled at. And so there's this intense urge. But I do want to say that, like, because our own pain looms so large in our minds. This is why I say, like, look, if you're going to have an argument with your spouse about like moral issues, don't do it when they just stub their toe, right? It's not going to go well if someone's actively in pain and you're like, hey, remember how you're not doing the dishes as much as you said, right? Like that's not going to go well when someone's actively in pain. So victimhood is something that we all can feel viscerally, especially for an active pain. But there's certainly a trend today in society that we're competing more for victimhood because it's something we all understand.
And maybe it's important to not let that way of framing it lead us to believe that most people are totally cynical about this, or kind of in a self-aware way putting on a performance. I mean, I'm just been struck, like, the more I study human history, the more I become convinced that we believe our own stories we tell ourselves. A less generous way of putting it would be humans believe their own propaganda, and that we are constantly reshaping our very sincere sense of the world, through these narratives that we build, that our communities provide. And so it seems like and this is one of the messages I took away from your book, it's important to approach every political opponent or, family interlocutor, assuming good faith, like assume that they really believe the picture of the world that they're describing. Because it seems like one of the real features of the breakdown in communication is this immediate assumption of bad faith on the part of the other party. And if that's your posture toward a conversation, like, it's over even before it's begun, it seems to me.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. So no one gets up in the morning thinking, I'm a moral monster, or thinking like I live my life as a total lie, and I just want to like lie to everyone I meet to try to get ahead. I mean, maybe you could think, maybe what statistics show about like 1 in 100 people are psychopaths. So let's remove the psychopaths here, American Psycho, from this conversation. And if you know a psychopath, I'm sorry, right? If you're married to one, I'm sorry. Some people are, but for the most part, people are trying to do their best and they believe their own propaganda, as you say, right? Like the stories that we tell ourselves are real and powerful. And maybe some people, they overemphasize their own victimhood, but they really truly believe it. And so what you can't do, I think, in those conversations is just deny people's assumptions, right? Or if people feel like they're in pain, you can't just go up and be like, you're not in pain. You're not a victim. Like, snap out of it, right? Or like, think more about it, because that's not going to work, right? Instead, I think we have to kind of meet people where they're at. This is kind of an emerging theme of the book, right? You have to meet people where they're at, take them for what they are. And once you kind of, accept someone in good faith that they're having a conversation with you, and genuinely believe what they're saying, then you can kind of move forward, right? You can understand who they are, and you can try to kind of nudge them towards understanding you as well. And they're good examples of people who can do this, right? They listen to the other person, and then you get them to change their beliefs through that kind of listening. But no one ever convinces anyone to change their beliefs just by denying their assumptions or experience.
Can you make this a little more practical? Are there particular strategies that you deploy in conversations, specific questions that you go to? Like, are there scripts that you keep in the back of your mind for these more difficult moments that you find particularly effective, both in guiding the other person, but also maybe in guiding your own brain away from your instincts, essentially?
Yeah, great. So I think the first thing people have to realize, and this is something that really surprised me as a scientist. So when we asked people, what should you say in conversations with someone on the other side to foster respect? People say, the majority of people say, I want facts. Give me the facts, and then I'll respect the person. And we say, great, here's some facts. And then they say, those are not facts. I don't want those facts. I want the different facts that I believe in, right? So because we have such different views of what is a fact today, then it's hard to have conversations based on fact. And everyone who's listening tonight, you can imagine, like, has there ever been a conversation about morality and politics where someone said, here's a fact you didn't know that I heard on NPR or Fox News, and you think, oh my goodness, you're right. That is a really great fact. I guess I'll give it my view on abortion or immigration, right? I feel like that's never happened. Instead, our studies show, right, that what really helps is sharing experiences, right? So then it's not a competition of who has the best facts. It's a way of exploring your personal experience with an issue, right? Your thoughts and feelings about it. And so, for instance, a study about guns we ran, right? If you're having a conversation about guns and someone says, look, I'm pro-gun rights because this is how many times people use guns to defend themselves in America every year. You might be like, well, fine, right? But like, what those statistics don't tell the whole picture, and I don't buy those statistics. But then someone says, I'm pro-gun rights because my mom used a handgun to defend our family from an intruder. Well, now it's a different kind of conversation, right? It's not about who has the best fact. It's about, oh, I can understand where you're coming from now, right? And so those personal experiences, I think they can't totally replace facts in our society, obviously. I'm a scientist. But I think they provide the initial way to find common ground so you can say, oh, this person is concerned about harm, right? They are concerned about protecting themselves. And so I think that's important to keep in mind. Of course, it's not always easy to kind of tell those stories that make you vulnerable. And so, we can talk about specific tips, but I think the most important thing is when you go into these conversations, go in them to try to understand the other person. And so that means I'm asking questions and really trying to get inside their mind, not, talking to them just long enough so you can say, yeah, but what about this? Right? Like, that's not understanding. You're still trying to win. So just ask them enough questions and for long enough that you can understand their stories and they can feel heard.
What you're saying makes a lot of sense. I totally understand the value of building rapport, and let me tell you about my grandma. You tell me about your grandma. We both have grandmas. We're both humans. Makes total sense. But I mean, it has a certain point, and at a certain point, and you allude to this, you do have to confront the fact that you are maybe operating on a kind of different set of claims about reality. And so I don't know. I guess, is there a certain point at which have you actually had the experience where you build or you watch a focus group or whatever you social scientists do, you like watch them building rapport, and then there's a point where they are able to productively transition to a discussion of sources of news and why it is that they have one party has faith in experts at a university, and another thinks that that's a mark that you absolutely shouldn't trust the information, and then can kind of get to some point where they can begin to share a view of reality? Or is your message kind of a depressing one? Like, do we have to lower our expectations and no longer really have as a goal getting to a point where we share a body of facts and can collaborate in a practical way on policy? And like, the most we should hope for as a society, at least in this very fraught moment, is to just sort of get to a point where we can at least lower the temperature and not speak about one another with such vitriol, which is kind of it's a much humbler political goal than actually getting to a point where we change minds.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think even lowering the temperature is an ambitious goal, unfortunately, in society today. And I think, listening and connecting, inviting people to share and validating their kind of experiences, those can lower the temperature and increase kind of goodwill and the willingness to interact. There's lots of organizations that are kind of helping people to do that. I think that there is some promise of people actively focusing on policy, especially when people are motivated to think about policy, right? So there's organizations that get policymakers together from across the aisle and have conversations, build our stories, right? Common connections. They both have grandmas, as you say. And then after that, they can kind of work together to make policy that everyone agrees should happen, but it's hard to get passed because of this kind of political polarization. So one of these policies is something like emergency medical billing, right? Everyone agrees you shouldn't go bankrupt because your kid breaks their arm, but it's hard to kind of pass healthcare policy with two sides being so divided. But this has been a success story in some states where people can pass this legislation because they built up this kind of initial relationship. In terms of everyday people kind of having intense conversations about epistemology, like where are you getting your facts from? Most people, I think, aren't having those conversations anyways, right? But I do think that just listening can kind of allow people to come together. And so I guess I'll say two more things. One is that, there's someone on the other side thinking that shouldn't you know the right facts too, and they have their own set of facts, and they're like, yeah, sure, I'm listening to this person's story, but like, how do I get them to see the truth? So you're trying to persuade someone else, and you're very resistant to you being persuaded by them, right? And so it's kind of weird. We're all like, well, why don't they listen? Like, I have the facts, but they're thinking the exact same thing. So I think we need to be a little humbler in our goals, because we both think that we have the kind of like, the corner on the truth. But I do think it is possible to have conversations and move people closer together. And I think that those conversations involve probably more listening than talking. And we can bridge those divides even in really contentious areas. Like Daryl Davis, I don't know if I'm sure he's been to the Village Square. He's an amazing person, right? He's a blues musician and a Black man who devotes his life to kind of talking to KKK members and getting them to hang up their robes. And he does it by having conversations with them and listening to where they're coming from and their worries and their fears, right? And so he does persuade them, right? He does change them, but he does that not by throwing facts at them, but by listening to their experiences and meeting them where they're at.
I want to transition now to some of these great questions that are coming in over the chat. And one question I'm looking at, this dovetails with what you were just saying about just the reality that we are drawing facts from different sources. And this is a question kind of about some of the differences across demographic groups and generations. So here's the question. How does your theory of morality apply to individuals of different ages who access information from different sources? For example, youth and teenagers are highly influenced by social media, TikTok, Instagram, whereas older adults tend to access information from news programs and newspapers. So what are some of the differences that you see across generational lines?
Yeah, it's a great question. I actually gave a talk earlier today for some folks up in Maryland, and there was a question from a student, and their question was, why have our elders forsaken us? Basically, like, why don't old people know about really what's happening in the world today? Right. And so I think you're a historian. I think from the dawn of civilization, there's always been this sense of, older folks who are like, look, the young people don't really know what's happening. And then young people are being like, look, the older folks don't really know what's happening. And I think one reason, that this question brings up is like maybe there's different news sources, right? They're focusing on different things. And I think it is important, right? The kind of diets that we're getting really shape where we're coming from. And especially because social media is such a powerful way to kind of incite moral panics. So we have some research on this that, social media pairs lots of different threats with these kind of virality metrics that create kind of instant movements, right? Really fast kind of like moral opinions and movements kind of for things or against things. And I think maybe reading newspapers, watching kind of like traditional news, it's like maybe not as fast when it comes to those moral movements. But I think it is true that both of them really trade off on fears and threats, right? And so they both focus on threats, but maybe a kind of different pace, right? Every time I watch local news, it's like there's a crime spree or like there could be a killer in your basement, right? And so I think these things are designed, whether in quick or in slow, to kind of like pump our feelings of threat and fear. But it's a great question.
So it's valuable to just kind of be able to step outside ourselves a little bit and observe the way we are maybe reacting and responding, and to the literally the dopamine hits, right, that are coming at us through these algorithms that are not designed to foster understanding of the world, but rather are designed to show us more ads and so forth. And maybe if we can just develop a mental habit to kind of see that, I don't know, it's like it's a slight way of hitting the brakes a little bit in how we're moving through the world or reacting to something, maybe.
Yeah, I agree, right? So we actually have some research that shows that if you get people to kind of unfollow the most divisive accounts that they follow on Twitter, they get kind of lasting well-being over time from that small act. So I think bringing an intentional awareness to the media that you consume and the social media you engage in is really important. And questions of age, I think young people are much more likely to use social media. There is some research that suggests that older folks on Facebook are kind of the most likely to share misinformation, for instance. And so part of kind of like using social media also comes with a kind of sense of media literacy, which I think is not inherent to being young or old. It's something we can all learn, right? But just kind of like using it, as you say, intentionally and with awareness of like what people are trying to get from us.
As I look at these questions coming in, I'm seeing one theme is I think people are struggling a little bit, Kurt, to have faith that what you're proposing can really apply to questions of existential meaning. So I'll kind of pair a couple of questions and then you can respond. So this questioner says, I'm a queer person. I cognitively understand why people like my deeply religious conservative grandmother are disgusted by gay people like me. It's rooted in their religious beliefs. How does understanding that help people like me? My cognitive understanding of their motivations still doesn't change the fact that they fault something I can't change at my core. And then another questioner asks a kind of related question, basically asking, if preventing harm is the motivator, are there any guardrails on how far one is kind of allowed to go to prevent harm? The questioner says, I suggest not. So if white Christian nationalists want to prevent quote unquote harm embodied in transgender people as they see it, then that means they would seek, and I suggest are seeking, to erase transgender people, to eliminate this thing they view as harm. So what does an individual, let alone society, do with that? So in these cases where it's like an existential question, I mean, I know you deal with this a lot. I mean, this issue, the issue of sexuality is so front and center for our students at UNC. How do you talk people through this issue in particular?
Yeah. And, these are really important questions. And I think for one, I want to appreciate, these feelings of threat and these feelings of harm for people who feel like attacked right? Existentially, folks are kind of threatening their existence. I mean, I think I would like to nod back to Daryl Davis a little bit, right? Who's sitting down with KKK members who are also explicitly against his identity, right? Explicitly against him as a black man and thinking that black folks are an existential threat to society and trying to kind of like really have an odious ideology about them. I'm not saying that we should all strive to be Daryl Davis and put ourselves in those risky situations, but I think it is inspiring, and the kind of drive for understanding he had with those folks did lead them to kind of hang up their robes. And so you can affect change by trying to understand and connecting personally, but it's hard and it can certainly be dangerous. I think the broader question is really about, I think this was Karl Popper who talked about the kind of paradox of pluralism, right? We live in a pluralistic society where we want different people with different views and different identities. But then some of those people, their views is against pluralism, is against that we should have people who are gay, who are black, who have, really like who are communists, who are, I don't know, academics, whatever, right? People who are against the kind of proliferation of pluralism. And to that, I'd say, I don't think that those folks should necessarily have a seat at the table and get to like decide what America is, right? I don't think there should be KKK senators and Congress people. At the same time, like they're part of America, right? So the folks that are anti-gay, I think we need to find out like their understandings of the world so that we can better kind of convince them. And you shouldn't have to convince someone, but there are folks who believe that, and I think that's a difficulty of living in America today. Yeah, it's a great question. It's really hard, but I do think that we have seen kind of moral change over time, for instance, in gay rights, and maybe we're kind of blipping back. But part of it is kind of understanding where people are at. And to the second question, I do think we need kind of protections in society to make sure that like protecting one group doesn't go so far as to harm another group. But those are always trade-offs, and I think really hard to make.
I'm glad you mentioned pluralism. I do think that there is this assumption, this kind of unquestioned assumption, especially run into it in kind of secular left-leaning spaces like the university, that secular multicultural pluralism is the neutral position. It's the neutral position from which it is possible to say, oh, I just accept everyone's beliefs. And, if you're a Muslim or you're Christian or you're Jewish or you're Buddhist, whatever, I'm sort of the neutral arbiter who is proposing a framework that allows everybody to just have their beliefs. And I do think it's helpful for people who have that worldview to recognize that they are making an exclusive truth claim. Like to say that the secular, effectively kind of naturalist, probably not supernatural frame of the world, in which all of these religious claims are just sort of quaint parochial, views of their path up the mountain. That is a claim that is making its own truth claim and therefore is denying the truth claims of others. And I think even just kind of taking a moment to accept that is helpful. Now, that isn't to say that, practically speaking, like history does suggest to us that secular pluralist arrangements in which we do effectively insist that people treat as private a lot of their most fundamental metaphysical beliefs, like it turns out that's probably the best way to organize a peaceful society, but that doesn't mean it's neutral and it's somehow on like a different plane than all of these other ways of viewing the world. So I think that's like a helpful way of framing this. Ready for another question?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So this person wants to know if there are basically some groups of people who are better at reaching out across the aisle, as it were, than others. So here's the question. When political perspective has come up, much of the conversation so far has seemed to focus on how people with more liberal or progressive beliefs can work to understand those with more conservative beliefs. I'm curious to know whether you have any data, even anecdotally, about whether certain groups tend to extend more attempts or make more efforts to understand the other perspective. And if you know of a trend in this regard, do you have any thoughts on how to encourage more people to engage in this kind of curiosity?
Yeah, it's a great question to come after your kind of point, Molly. So I was just at a New Pluralists convening, and lots of folks there are organizations committed to pluralism. I mean, some of the sponsors of this call, of this talk. And so, we look around the room and we're like, well, who's in this room? And it's mostly liberal folks, it's mostly white folks, and it's more women than men. And we all kind of like took stock of this, right? Like these are people who are like reaching out and bridging divides. And so that, there's not as many hardcore conservative folks or maybe evangelical folks who think that there's the, one truth or one way of viewing the world. And there's not as many kind of black folks who are fighting with, social injustice and like trying to regain losses in kind of current administrations, right? Like they're like, we need to fight. And more conservative folks are like, well, we need to fight for, like our worldview. And then it's kind of like liberal white progressives who are like, yeah, well, like let's just all have, a kumbaya experience. Um, and, and so it's not saying that that's the whole movement. So certainly, there's kind of libertarian folks, some conservative folks who are like more about kind of, let's all think of ourselves as individuals, and that can help society rise as a whole, and maybe keep those things private that you're talking about, Molly. But as a way of kind of encouraging folks, I mean, on one hand, you can encourage folks with the benefits of pluralism, I think, right? Look at how more productive or civil our conversations are when we kind of like do this. Another way is just kind of like just the raw value, I think, of like human connection, right? That we're better off just like knowing and connecting with others. And I do think that left or right, there is a lot of value placed today on just like the power of being able to learn and have conversations. So when I'm in, spaces with Republicans or liberals or, folks of different race, different religions, the part that they're all very excited about typically is like being able to kind of have conversations, sometimes just pragmatically to like learn and to influence and to like, think about their political agenda, but other times, just to understand for understanding's sake. So I think maybe the way is through, and the last third of the book is on this of like, how to have these conversations better, because I think we're generally better off learning about what people are thinking and feeling. But it's a great question.
I have a lot of respect for the organizations that you're talking about that foster these kinds of interactions, and it makes sense that they trend a little bit more left. But I will say the most diverse spaces that I am in are often like the local Catholic parish. Like that's actually where you have the most diversity across class lines, super multicultural. And I do see, I mean, I'm in a lot of these church spaces, Catholic and Protestant, sometimes Orthodox. And especially as these communities become more international and they're interacting through missions and sort of overseas ministries with Christians in very different cultural, economic, political contexts, there is a way in which it forces American Christians to see some of the kind of parochial dimensions of the American context. And I think it's especially true in Catholicism, just because of how international it is and how Catholics in America are sort of on the front lines of absorbing immigrants. So I will flag that as maybe I see it as a cause for hope. And I also, especially, I really see a kind of generational shift happening in among younger, especially younger American evangelicals. I just think that they've grown up in a more diverse society, like along every vector, whether it's multicultural or in terms of being more likely to have friends who are gay or transgender. So this hasn't necessarily resulted in a change in their theology, because they do believe that the Bible teaches certain things, but they have just a very different way of interacting with people and an ability to, I think, connect with humanity across these lines of disagreement that I think is different from what their elders were capable of. So maybe that's a point of some optimism.
Yeah, I think that's hopeful. That's great.
All right, Kurt, I don't know, maybe you were hoping to avoid this question, but now two questioners have brought it up, so I don't feel I have a choice. They want you to talk a little bit about Jonathan Haidt. And can you lay out, for those of us who maybe aren't totally up on all the trends in moral psychology, can you talk about this battle of the titans raging between Kurt Gray and Jonathan Haidt and explain a little bit more about these different ways of making sense of moral conflict and why is your view so much more awesomer than his?
Right. And it is. And John has identified me as his strongest detractor in this work on moral foundations theory. We've had debates in print and in public over the last decade or more. So I'm happy to talk about the beef. But here's the scientific meat of that beef, which is, so John took Richard Schwader's work saying that, like, look, Brahmin Indians, there's like the sense of divinity, the sense of community, the sense of autonomy. These are different conversational themes, right, that people talk about when they're talking about morality. And what John did is said, look, these are things that I'll call foundations. These are deep in the mind, and there's 3 of them, or 4 of them, or 5 of them, or 6. Every few years, he goes up another number, keep it fresh. I think the most popular kind of framework is 5, that liberals care about 2 of them, kind of care and fairness, and conservatives have an advantage, he says explicitly, and that they have a broader moral palette, and that concerns things like loyalty to your group, caring about authority, respecting authority, and purity, right? So this idea is really twofold. One is that there's these distinct modules in the mind, so concerns of fairness, like, everyone should get what they deserve when it comes to taxes, are fundamentally separate from concerns about like loyalty or authority. And all of them are distinct from concerns about harm, which is only one kind of little foundation. The second claim is, again, that conservatives have a broader moral palette with more values than do liberals. So that's the claim of the kind of Haidt camp. I think there's no good evidence for either of those claims. And I think the evidence, it's very easy to evaluate. So are these things distinct from each other or harm? Not at all, right? Every time we ask someone, like, why do you care about this thing? Why does this seem bad? It's always about concerns about harm, right? So what Haidt offered when he wrote this book, a decade ago, was really a liberal conception of conservative morality, arguing that, like, look, conservatives care about this thing called purity because they think it's about God. It's totally, for them, unconnected from harm. But this conversation that, we've been having, Molly, really exemplifies that, like, it's, questions of harm are kind of like baked in to these other values, and that people only care about values to the extent to which they're connected from harm. So one value that Haidt doesn't talk about, but I like, is the value of punctuality, right? In some cultures, it's very valuable. In some cultures, it's not. They can make it hard to like figure out when to show up to a party, right? If you're like British or American and you show up to, you're like at a Brazilian party, like you don't want to show up 2 hours early. But no one would think that's a moral violation unless you're late sending in your kids' applications to college, or you've got an organ for a patient that's lying on the operating table, right? And you're like, you know what? I should rush there, but I'm really hungry. So I might just stop and have a bite to eat, and then they die. So anytime we care about a value, we care because we tie it to harm. Now, it's of course true that liberals and conservatives make different judgments, I think because they see different kinds of harm, and they talk about different values, right? In conversation. Like if I tell you like there's a Liberty Caucus or a Freedom Institute, you're like, well, that's conservative. But those are just keywords, right? Those are like shibboleths in a way, right? If you think the old Bible story, right? Those are just words that we use to capture kind of like our identity. And so if I tell you like, who cares about the liberty of a woman to get reproductive health, you'd be like, oh, like liberals care about that kind of liberty. Or who cares about justice when it comes to, like keeping what you make, for taxes. People are like, oh, it's conservatives who care about that kind of justice. So these words make it seem like there's more of a division in terms of values than there are. And if you look at the studies, everything comes down to harm. And I guess the last thing I'll say is the only reason that Haidt, it seemed to Haidt that these things were different is because he cherry picked examples that conservatives cared about, like should you obey a preacher? It's one of the items for one of these questionnaires, which is clearly something conservatives and religious folks care more about. But if you say who should follow the teachings of a civil rights leader or a union representative, well, then it's about liberals, right? So I think these differences, the more you study them, they kind of fall apart. And underlying these things are conceptions of harm. And I guess because we're in it, the one last thing I will say is that we've done some work, and it's in the book, kind of deconstructing exactly how liberals and conservatives see harm differently to account for the differences in morality that Haidt talks about. So it's of course not just, not sufficient to say that liberals and conservatives all care about harm. You need to explain those moral differences, and we do in the book. So it's a great question, and I do talk about it in the book about how you get these differences in liberals and conservatives with a harm-based mind.
Well, I'm going to prompt you to go there because one of our questioners wants to know, are you saying that a person who becomes a conservative has moral conflicts that are different from the moral conflict of someone who becomes a liberal? So can you sketch for us how your way of framing things maybe helps us create a new typology, a new way of understanding that conservative liberal divide? Are there certain harms that you see again and again in people who identify as conservatives and others that reliably show up among those who identify as progressive?
Yeah, very happy to. And I just say, like, the kind of foundations thing doesn't really explain these hot button moral debates as much as it does about what conservatives think about eating your dog or something like that we don't actually talk about in the news. And so some of these understandings of harm are issue specific, like abortion, like when does life start in the womb? Evangelicals are more likely to say at birth, or sorry, not at birth. They used to say at birth, actually, in the 60s and 70s before they had a shift.
No. Well, we can get into that if you
We
want.
can get into this later.
Okay.
Right. We can get into this later. But it shifted. Anyways, so religious folks are at least likely to say conception, secular folks later, right? We can just say that. We can agree on that. But I think for a lot of these debates, the questions of harm really focus on two groups of folks. They are what I call the othered. So you can think of them as marginalized folks, like undocumented immigrants, poor folks, Muslims, right? These are people who are like outside the center of American society and power, right? Maybe folks from the different racial categories, right? Non-white folks. And then you've got another group, so the othered, and then the powerful, like state troopers, corporate leaders, authority figures, richer folks, right? Folks with more power. And so both liberals and conservatives agree that the othered are more likely to be victimized and are more vulnerable to harm and mistreatment than the powerful, right? Everyone agrees that. The ranking is the same. But you get some really big differences on kind of perceptions of vulnerability to victimization. And so that is that conservatives focus on the kind of individualistic sense of victimization, right? It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, black or white. If you get cut with a knife, you will bleed. You will be sad if your child is injured, right? Like there is a sense that victimhood is really about a personal thing, right? Personal suffering. On the other hand, liberals are more likely to focus on group-based victimhood. They're likely to focus on like, well, black folks are more likely to come to harm than white folks, right? Undocumented immigrants are more likely to be harmed. Trans folks are more likely to be harmed, right, than cisgender folks. And so the difference here is like conservatives really see a small difference between vulnerability when it comes to the other and the powerful. And liberal folks see a big difference, dividing the world into kind of more oppressed and oppressor. And this explains all sorts of issues today. So blue lives versus black lives matter, or black lives versus all lives matter, I think is a really good contrast, right? Because progressives say that, well, black folks are much more likely to be harmed than white folks, especially white police officers. But then conservative folks say, well, like, shouldn't all lives matter, right? Everyone can be victimized, and like cops put their lives on the line every day, right? Even though they're relatively more powerful than marginalized folks. You can think about taxation, right? poor people eat the rich literally, right? Like, let's take all the money of the billionaires and give it to the kind of poor people. Whereas conservatives are more likely to say, look, everyone should get to keep their money, right? Everyone is vulnerable to kind of the theft of taxation if you think about classic libertarian thought. So kind of everything, you know, what's the affirmative action is another example, right? Every issue that you can think of that's kind of hot button today kind of revolves around this understanding of like, is victimhood group based or is victimhood individual based? So I think that's maybe helpful, and I kind of lay it out more in the book as well.
If the next step, like, okay, I'm having a heated conversation, I've kind of stopped myself and said, how does this person see harm that I don't see? It seems like the next reasonable step, if I'm trying to understand, is to ask, well, how did the person get there, right? And so I'm wondering, I guess I ask this as someone really interested in history and philosophy and religion. It seems like the liberals and conservatives who have these disagreements that you're laying out, I think these examples are really helpful. I mean, there's something underlying it that I guess is where I would want to go after identifying the harm principle, which is to say, well, is there a different conception of human nature at work here? And then also, what is the story maybe that this person is telling about this country, about their community? Like, how is it perhaps quite different from the story as I understand it? So how often do you see conversations going in that direction? I mean, are those useful frameworks once you kind of establish the common currency of harm?
Very useful, right? And I think those are the conversation we should be having more instead of throwing factoids at people, you know, in conversations or on social media. Like, didn't you know this statistic? Right? I think these are the things that we should be talking about. We should be sharing the stories and the narratives that really like underlie our understanding of who we are and how we got here in America today. And I think that's what I've tried to do in the book, is kind of tell a story about, you know, who we evolved as and how our minds work and where we need to go in the future. But to understand where people are coming from and the harms that they see, I think you're exactly right, right? We need to kind of listen more to the stories that we tell about ourselves, because those stories kind of make up our reality, right? We're storytelling creatures. We're not statistics telling creatures. And so the more that we can kind of understand those stories, the more we can understand each other.
I want to ask some more kind of practical questions that are coming up in the chat. But before I do that, I want to say to everyone who's tuning in, before we close tonight, we'd love for you to click now on a link that we're putting in the chat window to complete the post-evaluation survey in the last few minutes of the program. We can't use the data unless you have done both the pre and the post evaluation. So there's my public service announcement. So I want to circle back, and you're just beginning to kind of get into this a little bit, and ask if you can say more about practical tips. So one person is asking, can you talk about specific words and actions that stimulate the fight, flight, or freeze part of the brain, maybe making people less likely to be open to different points of view, versus words that, I love this, that light up the rational thinking part of the brain? Yes. How do we do that? Are there key words?
Yeah, I'm not. I mean, I guess there are some words. So if you say the word Nazi, that's gonna stop. And people do it. You know, people do it very reliably in political conversation today. So if you bring up that word, it's not good. Um, I guess more than words, I think the important thing is to listen and to ask questions. So I'll give you a story because we're storytelling creatures. So I got in an Uber some time ago, and the Uber driver asked me, "What do you study? Or what do you do?" I say, "I'm a professor." And he says, "Well, what do you profess? What do you study?" And I say, "Morality and politics." And he says, "Okay, well, here's what I believe. Like, hold my beer. I'm a Christian nationalist, but not the typical kind." So what could I do, right? I could say, "Well, that's crazy," right?
And he
Like
used the phrase Christian nationalist. That's
he
how he
used the
labeled
phrase
himself?
Christian nationalist,
Yeah.
but not the typical kind. So I could have just been like, "Oh, wow, nuts," you know, put on my headphones and just tuned out. But instead I said, "Interesting. I've never met a Christian nationalist, let alone an atypical one. And so I was wondering if you can tell me kind of like, what do you know, what does that mean to you?" And he started telling me about what he thinks about the church and the state and the family. And I asked him questions about like, well, what about people who have different religious convictions, like Muslims? Well, what should they do? And, about the founding of the country and, all these things, these pragmatic things, these kind of like high level things, like where he fits into it. And so we talked for a full 20 minutes. I just asked questions. I kind of like put probing questions to kind of like clarify, but I wasn't like, that's totally wrong. And then as we drove up closer to the airport, we started talking about abortion. And he's pro-life. And he says, look, pro-choice folks, like I just can't help but thinking that they're like the Gestapo. They're like the Nazi guards at death camps. And right, Nazis. And so I stop and I say, look, I teach a class on this. I teach a class every semester about how to have kind of good faith conversations about contentious issues. And you can't liken people to the Nazis. It's just not acceptable, you know, because those folks who are pro-choice, they don't see themselves as Nazis, and I don't either. And what he did was surprising, if you've ever had a conversation about morality and politics, is that he said, I'm sorry. I take it back. I didn't mean, he's like, it's hard for me to say it, right? So I had some grace. He's like, it's hard for me to say this. And then he articulated a slippery slope argument, which is that if you don't respect the sanctity of fetal life, you won't respect the sanctity of other life, which is a fair point. It's a fair philosophical point. You can make that argument. I disagree with that, but I think it's a reasonable point to make. And I think as we ended that cab ride, not only did I kind of have more respect and understanding for kind of like where he was coming from, this genuine desire to protect his family, his religious convictions, but he also respected me more, right? And the kind of liberal academics that I hang out with, right? He's like, oh, they're not actually Nazis. They are trying to understand. And so the way the words that I cross were that I asked him questions to explain, and I invited him to share his beliefs. And then after he invited, this is connect, and then I invite, and then I validated civ, the beginning of civil conversations, CIV in the book, right? And that validation was like, I see where you're coming from, right? I don't agree, but I kind of make sense of it from where you're standing. And so those things together made this conversation go much better. And I could push back at the end and be like, whoa, no one's a Nazi, so check it, bro. Like it allowed me to do that because I listened, I asked questions, and I invited him to share. So it's not specific words, but it is just a posture, I would say, a posture of understanding and of listening and of learning, and not a posture of attack, and I think that's the main thing.
I love that story. And I can see how over the course of that cab ride, you built up credit with him. You built a rapport that then allowed you to challenge him a little bit at the end in a way that you probably could not have done so in such a productive way that would have elicited an apology if you'd done that right at the beginning. That's a great model for maybe how to think about the posture we should have in these tense moments. Well, I'm afraid that we are out of time. On behalf of our hosts, Florida Humanities, the Village Square, and our streaming partners, we would like to thank everyone who has tuned in. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you, Kurt. This has been so much fun. And good night, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.